Local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Frank Tomeno is our guest, and whenever we have Frank in, we talk about local history, and that's what we're going to do today. In fact, we're going to talk about newspapers, and there's a big history of local newspapers. But before we do that, we're going to say welcome. Good to see you again, my friend.
Yep, great to be here, Joe.
First question, first newspaper. What was the first newspaper in our area?
I believe it was the Whitetown Gazette, in 1793, way back. And I believe it was published in New Hartford, believe it or not. And it lasted a few years. But you know, those newspapers in those days really had no reporters. What they depended on is when you had travelers, say from New England, traveling through the village of Old Fort Schuyler at that time. And the printer would ask questions, what's happening in Massachusetts? So I think there were four or six pages. But then as the 19th century came along, and then you had the Utica Observer, which started in 1817, and the Oneida Whig, and you had, but they were never, 60-page papers.
Yeah.
They were just, and usually the printer was the publisher and the reporter. And,
Yeah. Frank, for some reason, when you were talking about the Whitestown Gazette, this name popped into my mind. Whitestown Gazette, Cato's Patrol, is that?
Well, Cato's Patrol, later came a few years later, and it got its name, Utica got its name from a city in North Africa. And I believe I'm right here. When Carthage, which was a neighbor of Utica in North Africa, fought Rome, Cato was one of the winning generals for Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And so somehow there's a connection with those wars. That's where it's got its name.
Yeah. And back in those days, Frank, the earliest days of our area, Whitestown, the Whitestown Gazette. Did we even have a Utica, or was that still Fort Schuyler then?
Well, it was Old Fort Schuyler until 1798. So, right, there was no Utica, no Utica at that time. And I guess the first newspaper with the name Utica, I think, would be the Utica Observer, in 1817. There were a couple of other newspapers, but Utica was not in the name. Yeah.
And the Utica Observer, really the Observer Dispatch traces its roots back to
right.
that.
It's the great grandfather of the Utica Observer, and the OD celebrated its bicentennial a couple of years ago, 200 years. And
wrapped up in the Observer Dispatch, you have the Herald Dispatch.
Yeah, well, there was the Utica Observer and the Utica Herald Dispatch up until 1922, and then Frank Gannett, who had started a chain of newspapers, he was from Rochester, bought the Utica Observer and the Herald Dispatch and joined them together, and you became the Utica Observer Dispatch. Yep.
Then you had the Sunday newspaper.
Well, yeah, it was the Utica Observer Dispatch published Monday through Saturday, and then the Sunday paper. And there was also the Utica Daily Press at that time, which was separate from, Gannett didn't own that. And the press published in a building across from the Children's Museum.
The building is still there.
The building is still there. At one time, they had Daily Press on top. I don't know if it's still there. But in 1935, Gannett bought the Daily Press, moved it into the OD building on Oriskany Street, and the Daily Press became the morning paper, and the Utica Observer Dispatch became the afternoon paper. And in the 1970s, it was decided to drop the name Utica because the paper went to New Hartford, Whitestown, down the valley. And the Utica Observer-Dispatch became the Observer-Dispatch. Yeah.
Wasn't the Utica Daily Press started by striking printers?
Right. I believe it was the Utica Morning Herald in the 1890s. They went on strike and decided to start their own newspaper. And I think the reason I think I'm right here. They were trying to come up with a name, and they found in a barrel an old wooden headline from some other city press. So they cut the name of that city and they put press. And
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. I remember reading
Utica
that
Daily
story,
Press
yeah.
was a nice paper. I guess when we were at the OD, the press, the morning paper, went to Rome, sold quite a few editions in Rome, and down the valley. Where the afternoon paper, the OD, was more Utica, New Hartford, Whitestown.
And then when they did away with the Utica Daily Press, they made the OD the morning paper.
Yeah, in 1986, they merged the press and the OD. Afternoon papers were on the way out. In fact, I believe the Rome Daily Sentinel is really one of the few afternoon papers probably in the world.
Yeah.
They do a good job too.
They do, and
Yeah.
it's still a family newspaper.
Oh yes, yes.
The Observer-Dispatch building, which still stands on Oriskany Boulevard, and you come into the building, it's a great-looking building. You come into the building from Oriskany Street, but that used to be the back of the building, wasn't
Right.
it,
Well,
Frank?
don't forget, before Oriskany Street, that was the Erie Canal, and most of your loading docks and all those buildings were facing the canal, which is now Oriskany Street. And the entrance to the OD was on Catherine Street. But that, in fact, a few years ago, oh no, not that long ago, I used a picture in my column with the entrance on Catherine Street. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
We come back, let's talk about some of the names of people that worked for
Yeah.
local newspapers.
Yeah.
Frank Tomato's our guest. We're talking local history. Today we're talking local newspapers. Short break, right back.